It was the spring of 1946, a world trying to heal after years of darkness. The war was over, yet its scars lingered in every face, every field, every silence that followed the thunder of guns. On the outskirts of an American-run prisoner-of-war camp, a group of German women, soldiers, nurses, and auxiliaries, sat quietly at a simple wooden table. They were thin, their uniforms faded, their eyes hollow from years of hunger, loss, and humiliation. For the first time in years, they were offered something so simple, and yet so sacred: fresh bread. Warm, fragrant, alive with a smell they had forgotten existed. As one of the women took it in her trembling hands, her lips quivered. The crust cracked softly, that gentle sound of life returning. And before she even took a bite, tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't just tasting food. She was tasting memory, humanity, and hope. Around her, others followed, some smiling faintly, others breaking down silently, the ghosts of starvation, slowly fading under the light of mercy. In that quiet tent, under the dim sunlight filtering through canvas, the war ended once more, not with victory or surrender, but with the kindness of a meal. It was not war that broke them, it was hunger. Hunger had no flag, no uniform, no side. It was the slow, invisible enemy that crept into their bones and hollowed them from within. By the spring of 1946, when the camps grew quiet and the guns had long fallen silent, the women who once wore the insignia of Germany's might were no longer soldiers. They were shadows of what they had once been. Their faces had thinned to pale masks, skin stretched over sharp bones, eyes deep and searching for something that no longer existed. Each of them carried in her body the echo of starvation, the ribs that counted months, the sunken cheeks that spoke of winters survived on crumbs and faith. They came from all corners of the fallen Reich. Some had served as auxiliaries, typing names of men who would never return. Others had been medics carrying stretchers through mud and blood. And some, barely more than girls, had been assigned to radio posts, hearing the collapse of their nation through static and intercepted cries. When capture came, they did not resist. They were too tired, too thin, too spent to raise their hands in anything but surrender. The Americans who took them in were not cruel. They had seen enough of death to recognize when mercy was needed. The camps were orderly, clean, and, compared to the chaos of Europe, almost peaceful. But food was still scarce. Even victors could not conjure abundance from the ashes of a starving continent. The rations were measured, simple: a tin of soup, a slice of bread, a cup of weak coffee. To those who had spent years scavenging for anything edible, weeds, bark, potato peels, this was a feast. It was on a morning heavy with mist that the women gathered under the canvas of a tent, summoned for what they thought was another inspection or routine meal. They sat on rough benches, the wooden table between them stained with age and use. The air smelled faintly of soap and boiled water, the scent of something almost clean. In the distance, they could hear the clank of kitchen pots, the faint hum of English words they did not understand. One of the American cooks, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, carried in a crate wrapped in cloth. When he set it down, something remarkable happened. An aroma filled the air. It was warm, rich, and alive, the smell of freshly baked bread. For a moment, no one spoke. The women froze, their hollow eyes widening. The scent reached deep into memory, cutting through years of deprivation. One woman, her name lost to history, clasped her hands together, pressing them to her face as if to hold in a prayer. Another leaned forward slightly, disbelief and hunger fighting across her features. Bread, real bread, not stale crust stolen from refuse piles, not dry ration blocks soaked in water, but soft, fragrant, human bread. The cook unwrapped the cloth, and steam rose into the cool air. The loaves were golden, imperfect, split open where the dough had risen too quickly. It was the kind of bread one might find in a farmhouse, baked with care, meant to feed not an army, but a family. The women stared. One of them, her fingers trembling, reached out before stopping herself mid-motion, afraid to be scolded, afraid it might be a mistake. But the cook nodded, his face gentle, and gestured for them to take it. She did not grab. She held it as though it was something sacred. The crust cracked under her fingers, and that simple sound, a sound so ordinary, broke something inside her. For the first time since the war began, she felt warmth in her hands that did not come from fire or fear. She tore a small piece off and stared at it, her lips parting but not yet eating. It was too much, too soon. Tears welled in her eyes before the taste ever touched her tongue. Around her the others followed. Some were silent, reverent. Others let out soft sounds, not of joy, but of something deeper, something primal, the sound of life returning to a body long denied comfort. One woman whispered a name under her breath, perhaps a child she had lost, perhaps a prayer for one still alive. Each held their bread differently, one close to her chest, another cradled it in her lap as if it were fragile. For them it was not a meal. It was a resurrection. They began to eat slowly, almost cautiously. The taste was overwhelming. The first bite softened on the tongue, warm and sweet. It tasted of wheat and earth, of sunlight and rain, of all the things they had forgotten existed. The texture pressed against their memories, pulling them back to kitchens that no longer stood, to mothers and grandmothers who had once kneaded dough by hand. The bread carried them home, even as barbed wire still surrounded them. Some of the American soldiers nearby stopped what they were doing, drawn by the silence. They had seen prisoners cry before, but not like this. This was not grief. This was something purer, harder to understand, gratitude born from despair. The women did not thank them in words. They simply ate, tears mixing with crumbs on their faces, their hands shaking with every bite. Outside, the sun began to rise higher, cutting through the mist. Dust motes floated through the air, catching the light like slow-falling snow. The camp was quiet except for the faint rustle of fabric and the soft, rhythmic sound of chewing. It felt for a moment as though the world had stopped to watch this act of grace. The war had turned bread into a memory. For years it was something spoken of like a myth, stories whispered in shelters. Do you remember the smell of it? The taste of it when it was warm? Hunger had erased even that. But now, as they ate, the memory became real again. Their bodies remembered how to be human, how to receive nourishment not with fear, but with thankfulness. When they finished, no one moved right away. The loaves were gone, but crumbs remained on the table. One woman brushed them together carefully and placed them in her pocket, unwilling to waste even the smallest piece. Another simply stared at her hands as though they no longer belonged to the starving stranger she had become. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was peace. A fragile, trembling peace born not of politics or treaties, but of bread shared in mercy. For those few moments, the war was truly over. Outside the tent, life in the camp continued, guards making rounds. Trucks coming and going, the steady rhythm of post-war routine. Yet within that small circle of women, something irreversible had happened. A boundary had shifted. They were no longer captives of hunger, nor enemies of the men who fed them. They were simply human beings, connected by an ancient truth, that food can heal what bullets destroy. Later that day, when the sky dimmed and the sun dipped behind the horizon, the women gathered near the fence, silent once more. They spoke little. Words were clumsy things, and there was nothing left to explain. But their eyes, those hollow, haunted eyes, now held a flicker of light. It was not joy, not yet, but it was life, and perhaps that is all the world needed then, a small act of compassion amid the ruins. Bread shared, humanity restored, and the silent understanding that even in defeat, mercy could still triumph. The moment the first piece of bread touched her lips, the world stopped moving. It was as if every sound in the camp, the distant clatter of mess tins, the low murmur of guards, the hum of wind against canvas, fell into silence. The woman's eyes closed tightly, her hand trembling as she pressed the bread to her mouth. For a brief second, her face twisted, not in joy but in disbelief. The warmth, the softness, the taste, it was all too real, too gentle. Her body did not remember what comfort felt like. For years, it had lived only in hunger and fear. Now, her tongue met the ghost of a world that had long been lost, and her mind could not hold back the flood that came rushing with it. She chewed slowly, as if afraid it might vanish. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling freely down her dirt-streaked cheeks. She did not wipe them away. Around her, others were still frozen, watching, unsure if it was safe to begin. But then another woman lifted a piece to her lips, and another followed, until the tent was filled with the faint sounds of bread breaking, crusts cracking, and the muffled sobs of those who could no longer contain themselves. The bread was plain, just wheat, water and salt, but to them it might as well have been gold. They hadn't tasted something so rich, so alive, since before the world turned to rubble. In the final years of the war, food had vanished from German towns and villages. Bombs had destroyed supply lines, fields lay barren, and what little remained went to the front. Mothers had fed their children grass soup, boiled bark, or thin broth made from whatever could be scavenged from burned-out homes. Soldiers and civilians alike starved quietly, each day blurring into the next. Hunger stripped away everything, dignity, morality, even the will to dream. But now, in a land that was not their own, after years of captivity and silence, they were tasting bread again. It was soft enough to fall apart between their fingers. The scent alone was enough to make some weep. For a few, the act of eating was too much. They took the bread and held it to their faces, inhaling deeply, their tears mixing with the crumbs. One woman, younger than the rest, bit too quickly. Her body, unaccustomed to fullness, convulsed slightly as she forced herself to swallow. She coughed, then covered her mouth with both hands, ashamed, as if she had broken some sacred rule. An American nurse, who had been stationed near the mess tent, approached quietly, offering a small tin cup of water. The girl took it with shaking fingers, unable to meet the nurse's eyes. The nurse simply nodded and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder before walking away. That brief human touch lingered like sunlight after rain. The camp itself was not cruel, but it was still a prison. The barbed wire fences stood tall, separating the women from the world beyond. Yet in that single meal the wire seemed to fade. For a few minutes, they forgot where they were. They forgot the uniforms, the surrender, the guilt that shadowed their thoughts. The bread made them remember something pure, home, home. The word carried different meanings for each of them. For one, it was a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Dresden, where the smell of fresh loaves had once filled the air on Sunday mornings. For another, it was a narrow kitchen in Hamburg, where her mother would slice bread into thin, careful pieces so that everyone could have a taste. For others, home was gone, burned, buried, erased. Yet even they closed their eyes and remembered the faint warmth of an oven, the laughter of siblings, the sound of knives tapping against wooden boards. Bread was memory, and memory was pain. As they ate, the weight of everything they had endured came crashing back. The nights spent hiding from bombs, the endless marches, the fear of capture, the humiliation of defeat. The taste of wheat mixed with salt from their tears, and though the bread was nourishing, it hurt to eat. Each bite felt like swallowing years of suffering, but within that pain there was something else: release. They were crying not only for what they had lost, but for the realization that they had survived it. The bread was proof that they were still alive, that despite everything, the war, the hunger, the loss, life continued. It was fragile, yes, but real. One woman began to hum softly, a tune that others recognized from long ago. It was a lullaby, one their mothers had sung when the world was still kind. Soon others joined in, their voices trembling, weak but sincere. The sound filled the tent, blending with the gentle rustle of wind and the faint crackle of a nearby fire. For the first time in years, the camp did not sound like a place of captivity. It sounded like a gathering of souls, remembering what it meant to be human. The Americans nearby watched quietly. Some smiled faintly, some turned away, unsure of what to do with the emotion before them. They had fought a brutal enemy, seen unspeakable things, but here, in this moment, they were just men witnessing the rebirth of compassion. The war that had taught them to hate seemed smaller now, almost meaningless in the presence of such raw humanity. When the meal was done, A few women gathered the remaining crumbs, sweeping them carefully into their hands. None were wasted. They shared what was left, passing it around like an offering. One woman broke her piece in half and placed it in another's hand. No words were spoken. There was no need. Later, as the sunlight shifted and the tent cooled, they sat quietly together. The bread had filled their stomachs, but also stirred something deep inside them. The hunger was not gone. It would never truly leave, but it was quieted, soothed, and with that peace came reflection. For the first time, they allowed themselves to think of the war not as a series of orders and uniforms, but as a tragedy that had stolen their youth. They thought of the men who never came back, of the families they would never see again, and of the choices that had led them here. Some felt guilt. Others felt sorrow. Most felt nothing but exhaustion. Yet beneath all of that, there was one shared truth. Mercy still existed. It existed in the hands of the soldier who served them food without hatred. It existed in the quiet eyes of the nurse who offered water. It existed in the bread itself, a gift that carried no judgment, only warmth. Night began to fall. The women moved outside the tent, standing in the fading light. The sky above the camp burned with the colors of dusk, orange, violet, and deep blue blending into the horizon. They watched in silence as the guards took their posts. The hum of insects replaced the sounds of the day. Somewhere, a radio played faint American jazz, its distant melody mingling with the whisper of wind. The woman who had wept first looked up at the sky and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't happiness either. It was simply the stillness of a heart that had forgotten how to feel anything but pain. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't see fire or rubble. She saw her mother's hands kneading dough. She saw a wooden table, sunlight streaming through lace curtains. She smelled bread, just like this, baking in an oven that would never again exist. The tears came once more, but they were different now. They weren't born from hunger or despair. They were soft, cleansing like the slow return of rain after a long drought. Inside the camp, the night deepened. Guards made their rounds, shadows lengthened, and lamps flickered to life. The women returned to their bunks, wrapping themselves in thin blankets, the scent of bread still lingering in their hair and clothes. Some whispered quietly before sleeping, sharing memories they hadn't dared to speak aloud before. Others simply lay still, feeling the faint weight of fullness in their stomachs, a sensation so unfamiliar it felt almost unreal. And as sleep took them, they dreamed not of war or loss, but of kitchens and tables, of laughter and homecomings that would never come to pass. Yet somehow the dreams were enough. They were reminders that even the most broken soul can still remember beauty. The following morning, when the sun rose again, the camp seemed softer. The women moved slower, their faces calmer, their eyes less empty. The act of eating bread had changed something invisible inside them. The guards noticed it too, an ease in the air, a stillness that hadn't been there before. Life, in its simplest form, had returned, and though history would never record their names, though no monument would ever stand for them, the truth of that moment would live on in silence. The bread had not just filled their bodies, it had healed their humanity. They were still prisoners, but no longer captives. The evening settled over the camp like a quiet sigh, softening the edges of the day that had been filled with an intensity few could fully comprehend. The German female prisoners of war had eaten, and in the afterglow of that simple act, something delicate yet profound began to take root. They sat outside their tents, in a semicircle on the grass that was still damp with the coolness of early spring, their eyes tracing the silhouette of the American guards moving in the distance. The fences that confined them, the barbed wire that had for so long marked the boundary between survival and despair, now seemed to shrink in significance. They had been touched by a small mercy, a gesture so unassuming and yet so powerful that it reshaped the way they understood themselves and the world around them. Some of the women spoke in whispers, voices threaded with wonder and disbelief. Words were scarce, for the experience of eating real bread after years of starvation had rendered language insufficient. How could words capture the warmth of crust yielding beneath fingertips, the smell of wheat carried on the wind, or the sound of a tearful sigh escaping from lips long unused to comfort? They instead communicated in gestures, small smiles, the nod of a head, the brushing away of tears. Their collective silence was, paradoxically, full of meaning. Each pause, each glance, each faint shiver spoke volumes of the pain that had been endured, the relief that was now being felt, and the fragile hope that had begun to flicker within them. The sky darkened into a tapestry of deep indigos and muted purples, the last embers of sunset fading behind the distant hills. Shadows stretched across the camp, cloaking the barbed wire, the wooden posts, and the tents in soft, forgiving darkness. The women leaned against each other, shoulders touching, some wrapping their arms around knees, others holding hands in a subtle, almost unconscious display of solidarity. The day had offered them a rare gift, but the night held the quiet reflection that cemented it in their hearts. For so long they had been defined by absence of food, of warmth, of dignity. Tonight they were defined by the simple presence of humanity, shared across the small circle of women who had endured together. Each woman carried her own memories, heavy and unspoken. Some recalled childhood kitchens, where bread had been baked by mothers or grandmothers, the smell mingling with laughter and conversation. Others remembered war-torn villages where hunger had reigned, the scent of smoke and ash replacing the sweetness of wheat. The bread they had eaten was not just food, it was an emotional bridge that connected them to a world they feared they would never see again. The taste lingered on their tongues, warm and comforting, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, traces of normalcy and grace could still be found. A hush settled over the camp as one woman pointed toward the horizon, where the sun had disappeared entirely, leaving only the soft luminescence of twilight. Stars began to appear timidly at first, then more boldly as the night deepened. The sky seemed immense and infinite, and for the first time in years, the women allowed themselves to imagine a world beyond the confines of their temporary prison. Some closed their eyes, letting the cool evening air wash over their faces, the smell of grass and earth grounding them in the present. Others simply sat quietly, observing the subtle movements of the guards, the flicker of distant fires, the gentle sway of the trees. There was an unspoken understanding among them. Life continued, and with life came both challenge and possibility. In these quiet hours, the act of eating bread earlier in the day revealed its full significance. It had not only nourished their bodies, but had begun to restore their sense of identity. They were not merely prisoners defined by circumstance. They were human beings who could feel joy, gratitude, and reflection even amid suffering. The bread had acted as a catalyst, awakening emotions that had been suppressed by years of survival instinct. Laughter, soft and hesitant, escaped from a few of the younger women as they shared memories and small jokes, tentative connections that had once seemed impossible. The night, in its calm and quiet, became a sanctuary for the unspoken healing of spirits battered by war and starvation. Some women ventured near the edges of the camp, glancing at the barbed wire and beyond, at the unknown world that awaited them. Fear lingered, as it always does after trauma, but it was tempered by a newfound awareness of resilience. They had endured hunger, humiliation, and captivity, and yet here they were, alive and able to taste the sweetness of bread. This simple act had rekindled a connection to the world beyond the wire, a reminder that even in the aftermath of devastation, small kindnesses could reshape perspectives and ignite hope. The night air carried the faint sounds of camp life, the distant call of a bird, the murmur of guards, the rustle of leaves, but it also held the whispers of memory and reflection. As darkness deepened, the women huddled near the glow of a single lantern placed outside one of the tents, its light flickering softly across their faces. Shadows danced across their features, highlighting the lines etched by years of hunger and suffering, yet also illuminating the faint traces of peace beginning to form within them. They shared quiet conversations about what they remembered from their lives before the war, about their families, and about what might await them in the future. Each story was a thread, weaving together the collective fabric of resilience and endurance that had carried them through unimaginable hardship. Even in this tranquil moment, there was awareness of the fragility of life. The bread had been a brief, shining moment of comfort, but the reality of the camp and the larger world beyond remained. Yet rather than despair, the women felt a sense of empowerment, born of survival and shared experience. They had weathered starvation, survived the collapse of their homeland, and now, even in captivity, had reclaimed a measure of dignity. That dignity, fragile as it might seem, was reinforced by every glance, every shared smile, and every silent acknowledgement of the other's presence. The night stretched on, quiet and contemplative. Some of the women drifted to sleep beneath the canvas of their tents, the warmth of food and the stillness of evening lulling them into rest. Others remained awake, gazing up at the stars, tracing constellations and imagining futures that had once seemed unimaginable. In that shared stillness, a subtle transformation occurred. The bread had done more than fill their stomachs. It had begun to restore their sense of self, to remind them that even in the aftermath of immense suffering, human beings could still experience tenderness, care, and the slow return of hope. By the time the first pale light of dawn brushed the horizon, the women had settled into a calm rhythm, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that life could continue, that small acts of kindness could bridge the chasm carved by years of war and hunger. The bread, eaten the previous day, remained